We're now at the last part of the symposium, and this is a book talk. Julia Payson is going to present her book manuscript, When Cities Lobby, How Local Interests Shape State Politics, and Liz Gerber will be her discussant. So I'll turn it over to Julia.
We actually pulled a bait and switch. Liz Gerber will be presenting my book for me, followed by the discussant, just in the interest of time so that we can maximize the Q&A. And so I'm the biggest shirker in this conference because Maria presented the paper and Liz is presenting the overview of the paper. So Liz, take it away.
So here we are. For me, it's the end of a long day. For some of you, it's just the middle of your long day, but what a great set of papers. So Jeff, thank you as always for pulling together such an awesome group of scholars working on such complementary issues. This is like the funnest conference I ever have all year. So thank you. And I'm so excited to be able to discuss Julia's book. I remember a number of years ago, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but when Julia first described this book idea to me, we were in Union Square in San Francisco at an APSA meeting. So you can guess how long ago that was, you can figure it out. Anyway, when she told me that she wanted to do a study of how cities lobby state government, my first reaction was, well, yeah, of course, what a great topic. My second reaction was, hasn't anybody studied that? And really the answer was no. So kudos to Julia for identifying a really important set of questions in a field that we all need to know more about, but we don't know yet. So there, a lot of what Julia is able to do here is sort of bring us from a very basic understanding of how cities do lobby state governments, and then bring it all the way through to test some really interesting hypotheses about the consequences that have really important implications for democracy. So I'm so glad you wrote this book, Julia. And in the same spirit that she just described, I mean, when one discusses a book manuscript, especially one that's already in the review process, quite, has been edited a bunch of times over and over by Julia, lots of comments. I think I'm gonna certainly try to keep my comments more to what does this help us think about and understand, rather than going through and on page 42, you did this or that. So try to keep it at a higher level, although I do have a couple of challenges that I want to throw out there, kind of not just to Julia, but to the group, and we'll get to those in a little while. Okay, so I've got to close this because it's blocking. Here we go. Okay, so my initial comments, why should you read this book? So as I mentioned just a minute ago, this really is an understudied phenomenon, which is about intergovernmental lobbying. And there are really important normative implications that come out throughout the book. Why is this not? Here we go. It's a new enough area of inquiry that the book kind of has to start with quite a lot of descriptive analysis. And that's a good thing. Julia's put together this major new data set on local government lobbying expenditures, and then has added a bunch of other data sources to test hypotheses about those lobbying behaviors on the part of local governments. And so we just learn a lot about this important phenomenon from those descriptive analyses. It also allows her to build up a sort of a mixed methods approach with both quantitative analysis and lots of small case studies and examples. I think I mentioned in my comments on one of the other papers that this is really an exemplary book in the extent to which Julia is able to do this really rigorous, methodologically sophisticated quantitative analysis, but doesn't subject her readers to most of that. She makes really good use of the appendices in the book and is able to present either more simple analyses that make a similar point, or to put those analyses in the appendix and bring more of sort of high level, results to the book, and to really make good use of examples to really enliven both the quantitative results, but then also to get us closer to understanding when she makes a claim that this is what I think is going on, lots of really rich examples that help bolster those claims. So I really think it's exemplary for those of you who are writing books using a mixed methods approach. You might want to look here. And then finally, of course, it makes some really significant contributions, I think very much to three sort of different fields. First and foremost, to the urban politics and policy, local political economy field that we're all interested in. But it also makes a significant contribution to the lobbying and interest groups literature. Even if you're not interested in cities, and even if you're not interested in states, I do think that there's quite a bit to sort of pull out. What of what we learn here is generalizable, and what's not generalizable to the broader interest groups and lobbying literature. Cities, for example, can't make contributions to candidates to state office. So that's a real difference between what cities can do in legislative lobbying of their state government versus what other kinds of groups can do. So I think there's a lot of richness there. And then finally, this question of intergovernmental lobbying and the relationship between local governments and state governments and different ways that local officials navigate that relationship, I think is also a really powerful contribution that this book helps to make. Okay, so I think of the book as having three major parts. Part one is more descriptive. This is chapters 2 to 4, where Julia asks, when and why do some local officials choose to hire lobbyists to represent them in other levels of government? It's important to note that hired lobbyists is not the only way that local governments try to gain representation in other levels of government, particularly the state level. Some cities have their own in-house lobbyists. She talks a lot about sort of the limitations of that focus, but it's actually not, I think, a great limitation. I think a lot of activity takes place in this paid lobbying space. And so she does a really nice job of sort of helping us understand what's going on there in very much a sort of rich description. Part two then asks the question, how does this ability to pay for private representation influence politics and policy making? And so in a sense, this is, sort of how does it matter? And that's chapters 5 and 6 primarily. And then she gets into the broader implications for intergovernmental representation and representation more broadly in chapter 7. And I'll say quite a bit about that towards the end of my summary. So what I'm going to do is I've pulled out a number of sort of what I see as the key findings in each of these three sections. And I'm going to show some of her figures and tables. As I said before, many of these are descriptive, but they help get across the main point. But then all of the rich analyses and the robustness checks and the more fully specified models and the discussion of, sort of the econometrics and so on are in the book. So read the book, but I'm just going to give you sort of the high level results. Okay, so part one, when and why do local governments hire lobbyists? And so she puts together a database of state lobbying disclosures in all 50 states, in which local governments are a major lobbyist. And so that's sort of the core data that she's using in this part of the book. She also combines that with data on city partisanship, city ideology, and state ideology. Some of you will recognize these data sets. And then she also supplements this big data set with more detailed data from several states. Okay, and so she makes like two conceptual distinctions. One is to think about the different targets of city lobbying at the state level. And she identifies three different kinds of targets: the legislative branch action, so trying to get the legislature to do something, executive branch action, trying to get the executive branch to do something, and then monitoring, which is trying to hiring somebody so that cities just know what's going on at the state level. And she's going to be focusing mainly, I think, if I understand it correctly, on the legislative branch action. And then she talks about 3 different kinds of policy goals or outcome goals that really drive a lot of this local government lobbying. One is to increase revenues. Another is to obtain earmarks. And another is to maintain local control. And I'll get to the distinction between increasing revenues and obtaining earmarks quite a little bit later on. So stay tuned for that. Okay, and so what are some of her main findings? So finding number 1, I would say, is that local governments spend a lot on lobbying. So this is just a figure that shows lobbying expenditures in California over 15 years. Sorry, I cut off the x-axis labels, but it's time. And so local governments are the interest sector in the dark black line at the top, and they're actually responsible for the largest amount of local lobbying expenditures of the state government. That was really striking to me. I mean, if you need a reason to read this book, other than all the great things I've said about it, this is it right here. It's really important. It's a lot of what's going on in state government. Another finding is that larger and wealthier cities are more likely to hire lobbyists. And so in this figure, Julia shows on the y-axis in all of these figures is the probability of lobbying coming out of multivariate pooled OLS models. And she shows that probability increases with log of population, with own source revenues per capita, and with median house value. It's interesting that it's whatever that one is, nonlinear in the log of income. And she talks a little bit about how income and household income versus the revenues that cities have to spend might have a different impact on their decisions to hire lobbyists. Another result is that cities are more likely to lobby when transactions costs and ideological distance are high. She captures transactions costs from the perspective of local governments as the number of lower house representatives from that city. So in other words, large cities in particular that have lots of legislators in the state government representing those same constituents, coordinating across all of those different decision makers may be much more difficult and may require professional lobbyists to help do that. Similarly, when cities and when representatives from that region are more diverse, in other words, when there's a more diverse cohort of legislators also representing that same city, it may be more difficult to navigate between them. And so the need for lobbying through a paid lobbyist increases here as well. Additionally, she finds that cities are more likely to lobby when they're more dependent on the state for revenues. So this is a figure that shows the number of property tax limitations, 0, 1, 2, and 3 that the city is subjected to, and the percent of cities lobbying in each of those categories. And you see the more the property tax limitations at the state level, the higher the percentage of cities lobbying the state. And then the last figure I'll show in this section is that cities are more likely to lobby in states that are both term limited and professionalized. So the x-axis is the extent of legislative professionalism. And we see that as you increase that, there's an increase in the percent of cities lobbying in term limited states, but not in non-term limited states. Okay, so there, just to summarize, there are systematic patterns in who's lobbying, and it's consistent with this notion that cities hire lobbyists when they have more resources, and also when they need to, when it's a more complex legislative environment and they need help lobbying for their interests. The next section, part 2, then switches to ask, how does municipal lobbying influence politics and policy making? And so here to that state lobbying expenditures data set, Julia adds data on state transfers, as well as some state level data from California, Florida, and Washington that is in more detail. So the national data set is at a higher level, a lower level of detail, a higher level of generalization, whereas the data from these states, which she uses at key points in these 2 chapters, are much more detailed, and she's able to pull apart some of the things that are aggregated at the state level. And then she also brings in some additional examples from other case studies. All right, and the main results in this section are that lobbying increases state transfers. So if you look at the intergovernmental revenues received by cities, those cities that lobby receive more revenues. And this is a difference in difference analysis. So it's sort of holding constant the prior revenues, and then what difference does lobbying make in terms of the state transfers. The second main result from this section is that revenue returns from lobbying increase with city wealth. So if you look at the city income percentile, the returns to lobbying in terms of the effect on state transfers per capita increase as, so this is comparing those cities that do and don't lobby within each of these income percentiles. Lobbying amongst the wealthiest cities more further increases their state transfers relative to lower income cities. And in fact, in the lowest percentile, cities that lobby get less state transfers per capita. And then the last thing that she talks about in this section is about preemption. And she talks a lot about cities hiring lobbyists and working with municipal leagues to fight preemption on all these different kinds of topics. And to be honest, I made up this word cloud. This is not real data, but I just wanted you to see the kinds of issues that she mentions are the ones on which there's a lot of lobbying. And of course, in these cases, it's harder to determine what the outcomes are, but she's looking more at the issues and where are cities lobbying against preemption. All right, and then finally, in the summary, the overview, she kind of starts with this dilemma that emerges from the previous 2 sections. And this is sort of what I see as the big finding in the book, which is lobbying may close representational gaps for large metropolitan cities. She finds that big cities are more likely to lobby. Lobbying helps them overcome some of these transactions costs and do a better job of representing their cities, particularly in legislatures where the state legislature is more likely to be Republican, that they can overcome some of those representational disadvantages. But she also finds that it increases inequality by disproportionately benefiting wealthy cities. So the very wealthiest cities are the ones that get the highest returns on their lobbying dollars. And so on the one hand, you have this sort of progressive improvement in representation through lobbying. So allowing it allows large metropolitan cities to do better, to have better representation, and in particular, to fight preemption and to get higher state transfers. But it also increases inequality by even further benefiting these most wealthy cities. I'm not going to go through this part. She also talks about, she kind of goes through a couple of the most common critiques of lobbying and sort of talks about which ones she thinks are the most significant, and then talks a little bit about prospects for reform. Hopefully these can come up in the Q&A, but I don't want to take too much time, so I'm going to move on and leave these for you guys to ask questions about. What I do want to talk about are two, what I see as sort of challenges underlying the research design. And again, this is not intended to say, therefore, Julia, you need to go write another book or do 3 more years of research. That's not my intention at all here. But what I do want to point out is that, these are issues, I think, that are inherent in the research design, and to suggest some smallish fixes, some smallish remedies that might allow you to move a little bit closer to unpacking some of these challenges. The first is that a lot of the analysis of what are the policy consequences of city lobbying, municipal lobbying, focuses on this measure of total state transfers. Remember earlier when I was talking about sort of the setup of the book, she talks about the fact that increasing revenues, obtaining earmarks, and maintaining local control are some of the primary goals of cities when they lobby their state legislature. State transfers includes both of these two types of outcomes, of policies, revenue increases and obtaining earmarks. A challenge, however, is that they're kind of different, and importantly, when we think about increasing revenues, we're really talking about like formula programs coming out of the general fund. How are states getting money, cities getting money, property tax dollars back to fund schools, or other sort of formula-based grant programs? A lot of the states have some kinds of tax and expenditure limitations, and then the state redistributes a lot of funding. Same thing with like gas tax funding, which is to some extent under the control of the state. So these are mainly programs that are coming out of the general fund, not entirely, but more so, and that urban cities may be most focused on. Obtaining earmarks, I think we need to think about a bit differently. So these are largely going to be, I'm thinking a lot about grant programs, particularly federal and special funds like funding to build a new highway. That's not really a formula-based program, right? That is an earmark. And those might be the kinds of state transfers that cities are most focused on. They really want to get those extra federal dollars into their region. They may not care as much about more money for welfare or for school aid programs and so on, but they really want to get those federal grants. And so it's important that we think about what the state transfers data are capturing, because I worry a bit that it's conflating these two very different political or policy processes underlying the revenue increases and the earmarks. The discussion kind of applies that these may be zero sum. It's like, yeah, you're getting these increases in revenues, which may be helping urban cities, but you're also increasing inequality. But it might be like, if you think of the politics here, it might actually be that they're sort of positively correlated, that in order for urban cities to get political support for their progressive redistributive formula programs, they've got to be willing to say, yeah, and then these rich places that are going to be contributing potentially more funds to those progressive programs, that they can get these earmarks as well. So I guess what I would love is some discussion of like what's going on within that state transfers data. Julia, I know that you've done a gazillion interviews of city lobbyists, so getting a sense of, what are their targets might be really interesting, as well as analyzing grant recipients. Is it the case that grant recipients really are these super duper wealthy cities, and that's why you see these large returns for those really wealthy cities? I think the answer to that has some really important normative implications. The last thing I'm going to talk about is black boxing state government incentives. So again, back to the same picture, we've got these 3 different kinds of targets or goals on the local government's part. And a lot of the analysis takes the perspective of local governments and asks, what are they doing and why? And then what are the returns to it? But if you think about what state governments are trying to do, it might be very different, right? And so you can think about different high-level policy goals underlying each of these different state government lobbying goals. Increasing revenues, we usually think about those as having the potential to affect equity. Do state governments actually give a damn about equity? Maybe another question, but obtaining earmarks, I think that we typically would not think of state governments as having equity issues being their main driver or their main incentive when they're thinking about how to distribute earmarks, how to distribute discretionary funds or grant funds. In fact, from a state government perspective, they may really want high capacity, high income, very professionalized cities to get those funds so that they get what they're looking for, which is maybe more efficiency in how those funds are being spent. And then finally, we didn't really talk a lot about maintaining local control, but if you want to take this thinking to that area as well, the state might want something very different out of local control, right? It's about who has authority to make these decisions. And so you would expect them to approach city governments very differently than if a city government is coming to them for increased revenues or obtaining earmarks. Here, I think some interviews of state government officials might be really useful. If Julia, if you think this is a path you want to elaborate on a little bit. And then the very, very, very last thing I'm going to say is there are 3 areas in this book that anybody out there who thinks Julia's done a great job and wants to springboard off this study, she just barely touches on a discussion of municipal leagues. These are really interesting organizations that we don't know a lot about, but certainly, they exist in most or all states. They're advocating on behalf of cities at large, not individual cities typically, but I think they're an important piece that gets just a little bit of attention here and could probably get a lot more. The preemption issue, I think, is also huge. And it's treated differently in the book. It has to be because it doesn't have the same link to measurement, which the state transfers does for the other kinds of policy goals. But I do think that how cities and states interact around issues on which the state is trying to preempt local government action is really, really important. And then finally, the ideas for reform. I'm not quite sure what to say about those. It's not really clear to me what the normative implications at the end of the day are if we start to unpack some of this heterogeneity in both what cities want and what the states want out of local government lobbying. So I'm not sure I have a lot to say about the reform recommendations, but maybe we could talk about that as a group. All right, that's it.
Excellent. Julia, did you want to say a few things in response?
Yes, thank you so much, Liz. That was clearer and better and more concise than even I could have done. And it was so great to just hear your reading of it and hear you articulate these arguments, and just the idea that this project I've been working on for so long is legible to you and get it is just really exciting. So I think I'll respond to just a few of the suggestions and comments you had on this point of sort of trying to disaggregate between the earmarks versus other types of state transfers. I think this has been a weakness in every paper that I've published on this topic. And I think it's just really tough because a lot of these state transfer measures don't actually disaggregate the sort of source of the transfer and where it's coming from, which is different from federal data. So at the federal level, you can very easily get data on grants, and which cities are applying for them, if they are putting up matching funds. And so for a while, I was considering, do I need to make this a paper that's actually about lobbying at all different levels of government so that I can bring in this rich data? But I'm a state and local politics person at heart, and what I care about is cities and states. So I decided not to do that. But I think you're right that I should pick at least a few states to just do the work and figure out where is this revenue coming from? And I do talk a little bit about, I hint and gesture at this idea that you mentioned, that the state officials might have very different sort of utilities that they're trying to optimize in the way that they allocate funding relative to the local officials. So from the state's perspective, they might want to just very efficiently allocate the revenue across cities that, as you say, are going to do sort of a good and efficient job implementing whatever the project goal is. So, I know that Beverly Hills is the type of city that, is applying for these fancy green grants that are going to put low flush toilets in the city council buildings. They're going to install solar panels. The state, it's an easy sell for them. They know that the project is going to be completed on time. Beverly Hills puts up matching grants. There's public spillovers insofar as these projects are green and environmental, as opposed to the more particularistic types of spending and transfers that the poorer cities are asking for. So I think this is the kind of thing where I always have known that I need to go a little farther here. And it was just useful to hear exactly sort of what your concerns were. And I think my solution is I'm going to pick a state or two and not go too crazy, but just go in exactly in that direction. And the one other thing I wanted to mention was on this question of the normative implications of reform. I agree. I think one of the arguments and points that I want to make is that it doesn't really make sense to start thinking about reforming or limiting this particular type of lobbying by local governments when actually the lobbying industry in general has just exploded in recent decades, both at the federal level, but also at the state level. And you look at lobbying patterns over time, and local governments are not the only ones who have just come to rely a great deal on these professional, facilitators who are sort of buying representation so that different levels of government can talk to each other. And I think a lot of states that have tried to introduce ideas to ban lobbying by local governments, they tend to be sort of conservative states that claim that they're doing this to somehow save public money. But really, it just doesn't make sense to think about tackling this particular angle of this huge industrial lobbying complex. And in fact, not having the voices at the table of the local officials relative to other types of interest groups and business actually seems quite detrimental to me. And I'm sort of torn between how much I want to take a pretty big normative stance on this versus being more measured, which is what I'm currently doing. But I do want to sort of make this point that, yeah, these reforms are sort of ridiculous. And I'm not sure how much I should just sort of explicitly say that I think that versus trying to do this very sort of pro and con measured approach. But yeah, thank you so much for those comments. And I'm really excited for the Q&A.
Just for what it's worth, I think you should take a stand. I think the not taking a position and being very balanced and, well, you could think about this or that, I'm not sure that's very helpful. I do think that you have important implications in the study, which is, there's no evidence that you're really screwing over urban cities. And in fact, it's probably beneficial to them. And the fact that Beverly Hills is getting money is not necessarily undermining that main result. So to then try to limit what cities are doing would seem to have a negative consequence for representation. So I think you have the strong enough results that you can say that if you're willing to say it.
And I think this goes to your point that if I can show that actually this inequality result is not as troubling as I'm initially making it seem because it's driven by this very particular feature of state funding, then I think I could make that. Because I think, just full disclosure of how this whole project came to be, one of the very first results I found was this sort of result that wealthy cities tend to do better. It was my job market paper. It was the paper that Jeff Jenkins helped me publish in JOP. And so I'm like very wed to this idea of the potential inequality concerns, even though as the research has progressed and as I've gotten to know sort of the mechanics a lot more, I've become much less worried. And so maybe I need to just sort of take a bold stand and say, actually, you might think that lobbying is bad, and yes, we have all these classic concerns, Schatzsnyder and the unheavenly choir, but actually, no, I think this is too important and too useful to greasing the wheels of like a complicated intergovernmental system. So yeah, thanks for that advice.
Hi, Julia. I love this work. I've always loved this work. I think it's fantastic. So thank you, Liz, for presenting it, and thank you, Julia, for doing it. I was just thinking about when Liz was talking about the distributional impacts, grants versus formulas and things like that. Are there any sorts of, direct service delivery that the state might be doing that, wouldn't be monetary, right? The state would be doing something for local governments that was not directly giving them money. The first thing that came to mind, and this is probably the vast exception, is COVID vaccines. Would you see any, relationship between the importance of a municipality and how much they lobby and their relationship to the state and the provision of this really, really important service? And is there anything else like that? I don't know if that might get around some of these questions, but it was just something that popped into my mind.
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. I focus in the book a lot of on the negative things that states can do for cities in terms of hamstringing them and like preempting them, like stopping them from setting higher minimum wages, taking away their ability to do things. But this idea that there's non-monetary ways that the state influences service provision is very important. I think a lot of it happens through counties. So the state makes transfers to the counties, who are then the ones that are actually primarily doing stuff on public health, a lot of stuff on education. And so I think, I'm totally ignoring counties right now. And I think intergovernmental service provision is something that I want to take seriously. And this idea that one of the things you might be lobbying for is trying to sort of outsource and get other, interregional agreements to help you provide better public services. And the idea of looking at something like COVID vaccines is really fascinating. I haven't been touching this work in a while because I've just been wanting to be done with it. But I mean, lobbying disclosure data come out quarterly, and I should be able to sort of see whether there was a spike related to COVID. I'm sure there was, although there's a lot of things changing in this era, and so getting at precisely what they're lobbying for would be complicated. But yeah, look, I think, and Liz was also encouraging me to sort of go beyond state transfers in terms of looking at outcomes. So yeah, I mean, different service provision things that I've considered are usually surrounding sort of transportation, education, public health. And oftentimes it's the lazy use of the census of government spending measures. I'm gonna go look at this audit data that you use in your work, because I think that could be really promising and interesting. I've sort of thought about it, and I'm kind of waiting to see how much people want to see on this and how much reviewers want to see on this, but I think it's a really good point. Thank you.
Thanks. This was great. It's great to see how this project has grown since the last time I saw it. I had a question about, and forgive me if this is something you've already done, but in terms of thinking about normative implications, I mean, one thing I'm thinking about is that, as we've been talking about today, or as some people have mentioned, sometimes, representation at the state and local level is not great. I'm thinking of Steve Rogers' book, which is hopefully forthcoming, or if not already pretty soon, just basically saying that state legislatures do a pretty bad job of representing voters. And so that makes me think that maybe cities lobbying is just a way that to help state legislators learn about where their voters are, and maybe that leads to better representation in terms of the match between the city's ideology and the representatives they get. So just something to think about. I mean, I can see that you have analysis about sort of mismatch leading to lobbying, and I guess I'm asking you to think about, is the reverse possible theoretically, and would it be something that one could look at empirically, if that makes sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, as you say, my original, so actually just on this point of the fact that representation is not uniformly good in state legislatures. And in fact, there's huge variation in sort of the quality of the delegation and how closely they are attuned to local interests and whether they are responsive or not. And that was sort of the original theory, was that it's this variation in representational quality that drives lobbying. And as you alluded to, I do look at whether sort of ideological distances or mismatches between cities and state legislators lead cities to hire lobbyists. And I do find evidence of this, but this idea that it actually might be, lobbying could be something that not only do you respond to it, but then in the future it improves the quality of the match. I mean, I'm sort of limited by the short-ish panel, but it's certainly something that I could and should look at. So I would basically just be sort of inverting the analysis and looking. So yes, the mismatch leads to lobbying, but then how does representation change in response to that? Because one of the mechanisms that I'm positing is that these lobbyists are providing local information, and if that local information is useful, then it should maybe theoretically lead to a better match. One thing I'm trying to decide is whether I need to go and collect an additional year of data. I think I leave it in 2015 right now. And I kind of like that because I almost don't want to get into the era of Trump. And also because it takes so much time to get this state level lobbying disclosure data. So I've been really torn with this a lot. So I might just start with the short panel and see if the dynamics that you suggest are at play. If it were the case that lobbying sort of improves this congruence, that would speak to this argument I want to make about actually lobbying is great. And then if I could then show why the inequality findings or results are not so concerning based on some of the earlier discussions, that would also be great. This feels like it's kind of scary, coming out of your PhD and writing your dissertation, you want to be so balanced and so measured. And so just saying a big thing like this feels still a little scary, but I think I'm almost there and ready to do it.
Great, thanks. First, congratulations. And I think you should now feel qualified. You are eminently qualified to say big things, right? And there are things that you can say in a book that can be justified, that can be more than what we do in tight articles that are focusing on advancing a more limited scope. So, thank you very much, Liz, for the cliff notes to the book. But cliff notes that make me even more want to actually read it when it comes out. But I wanted to hear more about, especially this question, this real equity question, and this concern about richer districts, and even the potentially negative returns to lobbying by the lowest percentile. I'm sure you've explored it, but to what extent can we be sure that this is really about the money in a city, right? And which could be correlated with something about its civic capacity to go and do things and what its needs are, or the attributes of its constituents. So Joe Gam and I have some published work showing things about big cities lobbying state governments on policy, not allocations, but on policy, where we show that like one finding is that the bigger their delegation is, the more they lose because they're kind of disagreeing with each other more often. Second, that the more alien their constituents are, right? They have more immigrants. And then we have some unpublished work that shows, so that's one thing, like if you represent different, more recent immigrants, you do much worse. Right. And then we have some unpublished work that shows same thing for like legislative districts. People represent more non-whites and more immigrants are bringing home fewer projects to their home district, and also this sort of homogeneity. The more split your home community is, the more potentially through this mechanism of not speaking the same or just looking really different to the people in the state house, you're getting less. And I could see those potentially being at work, but to what extent are we sure that this is about resources rather than racial diversity and racial difference between the pivotal voter in the state legislature and the identity of the city?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I definitely cite, the failure of big city bills. It's one of the reasons I look at the size of the delegation as like one of the predictors of lobbying. And actually, I have a cool analysis that Liz didn't think was a top hit. But when cities get redistricted after 2010 in such a way that they gain delegates, and their delegate becomes bigger, they become much more likely to lobby. And we think that it's precisely this, that the muddled queues and the larger delegation is actually tough to deal with. So I think that's absolutely happening. But yeah, this point, I think the bigger cities and the poorer cities, they are lobbying for policy rather than for transfers. So when we see that the lobbying isn't getting them more money or even maybe negative money, I think it's because they're not lobbying for these earmarks that the Beverly Hills and Palo Alto are lobbying for. They are lobbying for programs that are much harder to quantify. And so I think I'm just missing, so this also goes back to Liz's point about just trying to figure out what is the source of this money, because maybe it's not that these big places are losing, maybe it's just they have qualitatively different policy goals. And originally, I did think that this inequality finding was going to be closely tied to the types of voters in the district. And is it the case that lobbying only works if you live in a rich district where state officials know that the voters are going to pay attention? So lobbying, it can only be effective if you transmit credible information about your constituents that state legislators are going to take seriously. And they might take it much more seriously if it's lots of white or rich or elderly, as Becca points out, types of people. And so I do have, a lot of demographic data on these state legislative districts. And I think I'm not going as far as I could to sort of explore the relationship between state legislators and the district more broadly. I'm sort of trying to focus more narrowly on the relationship between city and state officials. But this idea that racial diversity in particular might be something that causes districts to be ignored or to have different types of projects. I think especially in this moment when we know just how salient and important race as a variable is, it would be sort of remiss of me not to look at it. And this is something that I sort of gesture at in a few points in the book, but I think it's probably going to be worth going much deeper, as you suggest. Thank you, great comments.
Let me just ask everybody the more general question. I think if my own view is if you're going to write a book, you might as well swing for the fence in terms of trying to essentially make a statement. Somebody once told me that Mo Fiorina was Mo Fiorina because he constantly overreached in all of the books that he published. That may not have been someone who liked Mo Fiorina, but I think the general point is I think you want to do something big, right? You want to go big, and I think we're often trained to be overly careful, perhaps. I mean, certainly economists have no problem with this at all, right? Making grandiose statements, and I think maybe we're not quite as good on that sort of thing. Not that I want you to be grandiose, but
no, I would actually be curious what people think, because I've thought a lot about this. And I think it depends a little bit who my audience is too. And again, I don't want to claim that lobbying is always good or that we should, sort of unambiguously embrace the rise of the lobbying industrial complex. It's just there's this lobbying that I identify that actually could have a lot of positive benefits that we aren't studying as scholars. Jessica.
Yeah, so I wrote 2 books. One that had like no policy prescriptions, is very measured, other than to say like anti-democratic moves are bad, which, it's like nobody argues with that. And then I wrote another book where I make policy pronouncements very briefly at the very end. And every time I present this work in the public realm, it's the only part they care about. So, I mean, I think you can kind of do both. You can write an academic book that is intended for academics, but your conclusion should really make some strong statements. And, I think it's an opportunity for you to engage in the real world. And, if you want to make policy contributions, you should do that.
Thank you.
Becca?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to think about this. It's so interesting. I have to admit that I didn't read the entire draft carefully, so it's possible that you do this. But one of my favorite pandemic reads so far was Jonathan Rodden's book, which I know you cite. But I wonder, kind of in the spirit of making bold claims, if you could go a little further and talk about some of the dynamics he talks about how cities are kind of woefully underrepresented kind of structurally in American democracy. And, if lobbying might be one of the ways that cities can kind of bring themselves into more equal representation with less urbanized areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly the intuition that I have, is that, in order to understand why cities lobby, we need to understand these immense structural constraints and inequalities that they're facing, at all levels, and going back historically, and just the way that districts are drawn, the way that population flows work, in all ways, our cities sort of underrepresented. And we keep seeing new instantiations of like the anti-democratic ways that cities get punished. And so I do think they're almost forced to lobby given this. And if it were more of an APD book, which at one point I thought it sort of might be, I was going to sort of trace the evolution of lobbying over time, because it started off very informally, where like the local boosters and mayor and business elites would go, they would get on their trains, go to the state capitol, and they would do their lobbying all sort of very directly. There were no professional lobbyists, but in order to get anything done at the city level, you had to get state support. And I think, I conclude with this reference to the fact that cities now are more challenged in some ways than ever before, given the Republican legislative strategy that Karl Rove instigated, and the fact that we have these red state houses across the country, given the Trump era and cities being sort of the forefront of this resistance. I mean, if we think cities should be able to compete and advocate for their residents, then we need to sort of allow that lobbying might be an important part of this story. And I actually think it is. So that's kind of, if I were to make a really big argument and claim, I think that's the direction I would want to go. And then I'm just trying to decide, how do I want to take these inequality concerns seriously or not? But again, Liz might have offered the perfect workaround where maybe the inequality concerns are overstated if the way that I'm operationalizing funding is just masking the real dynamic. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. And your intuition is the same as mine. Thanks.
And I think, to build on Liz's point too, like when you say that there's an inequality and that wealthy cities are kind of able to capitalize on the gains of lobbying more, they're not starting from an equal playing field with other types of places. And that's, I think, something worth addressing.
Right. And they would find ways to entrench their advantage, even in the absence of being able to pay for lobbyists. In fact, it might be the case that lobbying is more accessible to a poorer place. And it might be so I really strongly believe this, and I need to just say it. I'm still being very cautious and measured, but thank you.
So Julie, this conversation to me also is really important in terms of like who you think your primary audiences are. And the whole idea of writing a book is that it's going to be broad. You want it to be broad. You don't want to just speak to this narrowest audience at the bottom, which are people like all of us on this call that are really interested in city politics and policy. You also want to deal with this slightly higher level question of interest groups and lobbying, even people that don't care about cities. But I think the biggest audience for this book is actually this top one about intergovernmental interactions and how cities are both constrained, but also have mechanisms to engage in different ways with state governments and vice versa. And so thinking about, and again, when I say framing, I don't mean like totally rewrite the front end of the paper at all. But thinking about like, if you are going to speak to these normative issues, they really are about power, the relative power of states and local governments. And I think that, if you want to go hard on these normative questions, that opens this audience to you much more effectively than if you keep sort of a narrow, is this good for cities or not? I think it really sort of elevates the frame to this broader question.
The frame and the stakes, absolutely.
So forgive me if this is in the book, but do you look at the relationship between local level lobbying and private lobbying? So it strikes me that maybe the lobbying is actually, municipal lobbying is a reaction to the private sector lobbying, that they're actually trying to compete against them, not other, jurisdictions?
So just very, very sort of in a hand wavy way, in the chapter where I'm trying to explain why do some states have much higher rates of municipal lobbying than other states, I do sort of look at other interest groups, and it does seem like cities lobby more in places where there's more lobbying by all types of interest groups. But I sort of don't go farther than that and sort of exploit from year to year. We actually have variation in both of these things and which came first, because my sense is actually it was sort of the corporate lobbying group that started moving, and then the availability and the supply of lobbyists quickly got sort of picked up by local governments, because they just get so impacted by everything states do. I mean, the incentives to lobby are just huge. And I think lobbyists figured this out. Certainly local government officials figured this out. So I think, and I don't just have lobbying disclosures by cities. I have all lobbying disclosures in the states in each year. So I can absolutely sort of look at what are the other relevant sectors and what are they doing over time. It would be difficult to sort of draw causal claims, but I think just to paint a richer picture about, this is not happening in isolation. And one of my points is, if we were to restrict cities, then it gives these other groups outsized influence, and we don't want that. So I think it could be, I could absolutely bring in just some of that data. So that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I just was thinking, when you said that most states are red at this point, and of course big cities tend to be blue, I'm thinking about the role ALEC has played pushing for states to, do preemption. This, in many ways, this could be actually a direct response to these private industry wanting things that are directly at odds with the cities, and the states kind of almost getting caught in the middle.
Absolutely. And we're seeing a huge rise in response to ALEC. Then we're seeing things like the Local Solution Support Center, which is like a huge hub of, local officials who are trying to share best practices about how to advocate for their interests in state government. So I think it's totally, a very closely interacted and interrelated process. Yeah, thanks. It's great.
Any final thoughts at all?
Thank you everyone for taking the time, and especially to Liz. I can't tell you how helpful this was, and I wish that I could somehow, repay you. This is just,
Well,
great.
you will someday. Don't worry.
Can't wait.
No, I have to say it was a delight. I will also say, my first slide said, "Why should you read this book?" But I should repeat it. Like, I think that it's really a model of scholarship that. The next conference, somebody's going to be saying, yeah, you should do that thing just like in Julia Payson's book. So definitely look forward to it when it's out. And Julia, you did a great job.
Thank you. It's a big relief.
So I think everybody did a great job at the symposium. I was very pleased, as I wrote in the chat a little while ago. I thought, this is my first extended event on Zoom. I've done workshops. And I think it's, while ideally you want to be able to meet in person and have everybody in person so that you can chat between and, talk about other things. As a second best, it's not too bad, right? I really thought this went well. I was, I'm optimistic as I go forward and start Zooming next week with a class. So, and doing more symposia, because I think probably we're going to be in this format for the rest of this year, or at least a good chunk of this year, probably. We'll see. But thanks to everybody here, the individuals and the duos who gave papers, the 4 discussants. As I mentioned, I'll be publishing the papers in the second issue of 2021 in JPipe, and I'll be in touch with each of the paper givers, probably in the next couple of days, just based upon what I saw in the paper, what we talked about here at the conference, at the symposium, and next steps. So,
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
And Anne and Aubrey too.
And Aubrey and Anne, who were excellent as always, right? As I said before, they make it possible for me to do these things. So they are pivotal. They are critical. Thanks very much, guys.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Be safe, everybody.
Until next time.